Hello again. This time I'd like to talk about what I call categories of archaeology. And when people talk about archaeology, we talk about a variety of things. Um, but of course, we're primarily interested in the ancient Near East. But there are different labels for archaeology. For example, prehistoric means anything before written records. And of course, that is different in different parts of the world. Here in North America, where probably most of you watching this live, that would mean anything prior to 1500 AD would be prehistoric, simply because there were no written records here until the Europeans arrived. Um, so we see then, even in the Middle East and elsewhere, there are no written records until about 3000 BC. That's find that in Mesopotamia, and to some effect we also in Egypt. So in New World archaeology, North America, South America, Central America, we would call it pre-Columbian, would be before AD 1500 because that's before Columbus came. So that would be prehistoric. Now in Syro-Palestinian archaeology, our focus is upon what's sometimes called the Levant or the Near East. This is the area roughly corresponding to the Middle East, depending on how you set those boundaries. But we're talking about Egypt, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, parts of Turkey could all be included in this. But Syro-Palestinian archaeology tends to focus on Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So that's one label, that's one category. Another would be focus on the general Levant or Near East, which would be broader. Classical archaeology has to do with archaeology as it relates to classical studies, so Greco-Roman studies and that sort of thing. So this would include areas of Greece and Rome and Turkey and the Aegean. Historical archaeology then would be anything after the time you have written records. So here in North America, after 1500 would be historical archaeology. And of course, for what we're primarily concerned about, we want to relate the material to the biblical record, which of course is a historical record. So we're really interested, I suppose, in this course with historical archaeology in Levant, although our interest could go further afield as it relates to the New Testament and so forth. So we'll see then written records are going to supplement or help us determine our excavations. So there are archaeological periods we need to look at, and archaeological periods are rather broad as well, normally relating to a common tool material or material in which tools, weapons were made out of. Neolithic, for example, means the New Stone Age. This is where pottery first appeared, but the tools are made from lithos or stone, the New Stone Age. Chalcolithic means the Copper Iron Age, where they're using not only stone tools, but they're using copper tools as well. Then there's the Bronze Age. And I'm going through this rather rapidly because I could spend a lot more time on it, but you can go back and look through this. The Bronze Age then gets us into the period of the patriarchs and up to the time of the Exodus and into the time of the conquest and that sort of thing. So roughly from 3000 to 1200 BC. So when we're talking about biblical times, Bronze Age covers quite a bit of the Old Testament. First written records in Mesopotamia around 3000 BC, also in Egypt at the same time. Now bronze is an alloy where you take copper. Copper is very soft or malleable. You can pound it into all kinds of sizes and shapes. That's why we use it to make wire, we use it to make tubing, that sort of thing. But it's not very durable. If you make an edge on it, a blade on it, the blade will get dull very quickly. So in fact, you have to be rather careful with it. And bronze, which would basically be the addition of a little bit of tin to that copper, will make it much more durable. This will give you a technological advantage over your enemy or your opponents in both weaponry as well as tools. So archaeologists tend to divide the Bronze Age into three periods: early, middle, and late. And I won't say much more about that right now, but you can see the dates there. By the way, this is a projectile point or arrowhead, so to speak, made out of bronze. We found this in Jordan at the fortress where I've worked at Khirbet Medabia, which is in the area which would be Moab of the Old Testament. Well, the Iron Age, this is really where you get into all the periods of the united monarchy, the divided monarchy, the period of the prophets and so forth. So this is really the highlight of the age of ancient Israel. Iron Age runs from roughly 1200 to 332 BC. Very precise date there at the end. 332 is the coming of Alexander the Great into the region. This is divided into 3 categories. Now, by the way, even with the bronze, where it's early, middle, and late, there are further designations beneath early, early, middle, middle bronze, 2A, and so forth. The Iron Age is also divided into 3. This time using typically Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. Not early, middle, and late, but Iron 1, Iron 2, Iron 3, and there are other designations, Iron like 2C, Iron Age 3C, that sort of thing. You can subdivide those as well. So you can see the periods, roughly 300-year periods. Iron, of course, much more durable than bronze, and we still use iron today, except we make it into an alloy that we call steel by adding carbon to it. Here's a very typical Iron Age lamp. Iron 2 lamp. The oil would go in here, the wick would come out here and be ignited. It would then draw the oil up the wick, and you'd have a nice light here. So this is Iron 2 lamp here. Behind it, that's a Bronze Age lamp, harder to see. Now the later periods, we have Hellenistic, early Roman, late Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Ottoman, and modern. So this is just giving you a brief overview of archaeological periods that you'll probably run into as you're working on your papers and that sort of thing. And again, these are fairly specific for Palestine, for Jordan, for Syrio-Palestinian archaeology. These periods would be different elsewhere, say in Europe or Africa or someplace like that. So the Hellenistic period from the time of Alexander the Great until the time of the Roman takeover in 63 BC, and then the early Roman period up to the early 2nd century, 135, late Roman period up to the legalization of Christianity, and then we have the Byzantine period, which is really the later Roman Christian era for about 300 years. Then there's an Islamic invasion coming from Arabia. This takes place in 640 down to 1516, and that's when the Ottomans, who are Islamic by the way, but they come to control this area of the Middle East. Then we get to the time of World War I, which we call the modern period for, say, the last 100 years. Now, I talked a little bit about this when I talked about what is archaeology, dating periods or dating methods. But I wanted to hit it here again just briefly. Relative dating as opposed to absolute dating. Absolute dating using written records, inscriptions, I suppose, that says this building, cornerstone of a building. We do this sometimes, built in 2010 or whatever. Then we would find that building, that cornerstone, say, well, looks like this building was built in a very specific year that we can date. But that's very atypical. You never find that in the ancient world. But what you do find, of course, are layers of things. Sometimes inscriptions just give us a clue to the date. More likely, we're going to use relative dating. And we have the layers. So here I have a picture of layer cake. You see the slice down through it. You can see all the nice icing and all the various layers of the cake. So an archaeological tell is somewhat like this. I mean, obviously, it's not quite that precise, that even. That would actually make our life a lot easier if it was. Maybe it'd be more boring as well, right? But at any rate, down here you see a drawing of what's perhaps more typical, but there are layers there. And these layers are not always even, and they sometimes sort of fan out and get thinner and disappear. Sometimes there are wall lines, sometimes there are ash layers, and so forth. What we find in those layers then will help us determine the date, and typically that's going to be the pottery. In later times, I mean by later times, by my way of thinking, you might have coins that are there, but coins are actually not invented until the 6th century BC, and sometimes they have a date. They often have a date, or at least an image of a ruler, so you can begin to date things that way. But again, mostly we use pottery, especially for Near Eastern archaeology. It's prolific. Pottery is everywhere. Once pottery is made, it's a sort of man-made stone, right? Hard to lose. Radioactive material is also used, sometimes carbon dating, which uses half-life. So this is just an overview of it. Basically, carbon-14 is radioactive carbon. It is an isotope, sometimes called radiocarbon, and it's released into the atmosphere. It's created by energy from the sun in the upper layers of the atmosphere. This gets mixed into the atmosphere, and then, as you know, with plants, they take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. So as they take in the carbon dioxide, they're taking in carbon dioxide, a very small percentage of which is carbon-14 instead of carbon-12. Now, we won't go into all the details here, but basically that means that this carbon-14 gets into the plant life, then it gets into the animals because they eat the plants, and other animals eat those animals. And so we see that all of us are intaking carbon-14, all living things, until they die. Then that carbon-14 begins to break down into carbon-12. We take the half-life of that, which is 5,730 years. So if you had, say, a gram of carbon-14, which would be an awful lot, you would have a half a gram in 5,730 years. And then in the next 5,730 years, you'd have half of that half a gram, so a fourth of a gram, and so forth, and diminishing. It's exponential. So by using that and calibrating it, we can get some pretty good dates. So here's just a little diagram that shows where the carbon-14 comes from the upper atmosphere, energized by the energy of the sun, goes into the plants, goes into the animals. When the animals die, it goes back and begins to decay. This was all done by a man who worked in Chicago, University of Chicago. His name was William Libby. He did this tested this idea, and he got the idea this could be used to date things. And he actually used some of the Egyptian remains that were at in Chicago to test it, because those things had already been dated. And he found that it worked pretty well. Now, there were times when there were changes in it. Why is that? Well, the idea here is that the carbon-14 did not always say stable percentage in the atmosphere. So they would check that through this curve of unknowns by testing things that were known to figure out the change. So I'll let you look at that more closely yourself. Sometimes this could be calibrated by Dendrochronology. This means that the rings of a tree, each ring of the tree is formed in a year. So if we would bore into a tree, very old trees like bristlecone pines are almost 5,000 years old, we take that sample, we test it for the radiocarbon in it, we can begin to calibrate it with what's called a Seuss curve. So here's where the bristlecone pines are located. And by doing this, we can calibrate the whole thing. All right, I hope this helps. Take care.